the floor, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Where to start on this particular bill? I guess I'll just suggest that for part of my life, I had the responsibility of drafting business plans for folks who were attempting to start businesses. Most of the time, they were looking for financing from venture capital, private sources, not necessarily banks. But they had to draft a plan to suggest how they were going to start a particular business, what their goals were, and they had to itemize every last detail of costs associated with the startup, projections for the future, potential revenue, citing sources and evidence to back up their projections. There's a lot to putting together a proposal like that to get someone to loan you a little bit of money. And I guess it comes to mind because of the great difference between what happens in the real world when you have to actually convince people that your proposal and your policy is good, and government, when if you simply have the majority, you can tell people that it's good, and it doesn't have to be. And this bill is a good example of it. And it's been kicking around in this legislature for a number of years, variations of this and expansions of the current 830G statute. I can certainly go through the bill as we had before. I know Representative Weir did a little bit of that. I might just touch on a few things to point out just how absurd and vague this proposal is. And if it was a business plan, I can tell you that it would succeed in producing a response, a favorable response from someone funding the idea 0% of the time. As was pointed out, it commingles right out of the gate the notion that interested parties, both nonprofit organizations and housing developers, have standing to be the ultimate stick, as was characterized by the chairman, at the end of the day, if a municipality fails to live up to this proposal. By virtue of the later section of the bill, which he mentioned, which I think is in lines 247 through 251, somewhere 52, something like that, about how they can sue the town for its failure. I guess one thing I would say about this is that even the folks that have been contacting us in droves, I might add, that are in opposition to this proposal, I think that they are giving up too much ground in their arguments to acknowledge that somehow there has to be a participation by municipalities in this creation of affordable housing, and this, in particular, this fair share plan. And I reject that out of hand, Mr. Chairman. I don't believe that towns have any obligation whatsoever to participate in any of this. The fact of the matter is that the people that live in those towns own the property there. They should make the decisions about what happens in their community. In fact, we have a structure of government. I talked earlier about right-sizing government. And the fact is that we have the right-sized government in place there, and that's called the local town government. And they even have something called the Planning and Zoning Committee. And that Planning and Zoning Committee is duly elected by the residents of the town, property owners and not property owners, to speak up about what they want their town to look like. And if they don't like the way they want the town is looking, they want to change it, they certainly can change those representatives anytime they wish. Well, as elections come up. But it's only a 2-year cycle generally, and I think it would be easy to do. I think that reality and history shows us that the towns in Connecticut look pretty much like they choose to, except in other cases where the state or federal government has intervened and forced them to do things they wouldn't otherwise have chosen to do. And we can talk about a lot of other those types of things, eminent domain, giant infrastructure projects and so forth that have had impacts, not always negative, but sometimes negative on municipalities. So, without getting too far off topic, I just want to suggest that somehow I don't see it the same way other people do, that somehow there has to be some law like 830G or some fair share bill or some participation on behalf of municipalities for the dreams and desires and goals of the people that are putting forth this type of legislation. If Connecticut is out of room and has no more capacity, well, then Connecticut's out of room and has no more capacity. Now, I don't think that's the case, and I think that there are development projects going on all the time, but they go on naturally based on market factors. And that is what is ignored in all of this big government nonsense. And forgive me for using those terms, but this bill is nonsense. And I will come back to that in a moment to illustrate why I say that. If the state of Connecticut was a viable place for people to start new business initiatives, if the state of Connecticut was a viable place to retire as a senior citizen, if the state of Connecticut was a better place to be secure in your safety and possessions, maybe there'd be more people desirous of planting seeds here, investing in the future, starting businesses, growing businesses, building affordable housing, and so on. But the fact of the matter is, we have loads of problems. All of them, in my mind, created by state government. The state government has created a situation where, well, the seniors, let's do that part. That's easy. Connecticut taxes senior citizens on both Social Security and pension income. Plenty of other states don't do that. It's counterproductive. That's why. Because people work very hard all their lives, and then they want to retire in the state that they lived their whole life, and they can't afford to. They end up having to move away to sunny Florida or South Carolina or someplace because the grass is greener and there's less taxation. The property taxes in this state are second only to New Jersey, which is ironically the state that the advocates for this policy point to as some sort of panacea or utopia for this type of policy. It's not. Property taxes are hurting every single person in the state. And if I could interview people who are loading up their moving trucks to go to other places, I think they would put the property taxes really high on the list of the reasons why. Crime, which has been on the rise the last several years, is a direct result. The increase in crime is a direct result of policies passed in this building that have undermined law enforcement itself, undermined the criminal justice system, have let violent felons out of prison early, and so on. I see the chairman is making motions behind me that I should stay on topic, but I am on topic, and I'll get closer back to the meat of the bill to satisfy his concerns. But the fact of the matter is, this policy is the government using force to create activity that is not occurring naturally for the reasons I suggested. And it doesn't work. It's much like a lot of other legislation that we talked about today, where you think that, oh, if we tell this group that we're going to do this to them and that somehow it's all going to be better. No, it's not going to be better. What needs to happen is for the state government to recognize that people that choose to live in certain communities, let's take Fairfield County particularly. Those are the folks that are most ardently in opposition to this type of legislation in 830G, generally speaking. And that is because the people that live there, they're fine people. They're great people, just like everyone everywhere else in this great state. But they pay a lot of money for their property. And they pay a lot of money because they want to live in a certain type of community. That's kind of how our world works. You know, people work hard, they achieve, and then they get to experience the fruit of their labor by having successful lives, and much more, I might add. They get to pass that on to future generations. They get to create generational wealth. They get to improve the quality of life for people in the future who aren't even related to them. Those are all great positives created by the freedom of the marketplace being able to work and rewarding people for their efforts. When you come along with a policy that says, well, I know you paid $3 million for your house because you worked your butt off your whole life, or you invented some miracle cure, or you run a business that employs 10,000 people, and you worked hard and you should reap the fruits of that labor. But now we're going to tell you that the home that you bought and the rules that you live under in your community and the elected officials that you put in office, they don't have a say anymore in what our community looks like. They get annoyed, and rightfully so, because we're no longer right-sizing government anymore when the state is telling towns what to do. I said I was going to mention that this bill is nonsense. Well, my argument for that would be to just look at the words in this bill. As I mentioned, if it was a business plan, it would go nowhere, because all it is a collection of words that mean nothing. Fairly allocating in line 78. Determining the need for affordable housing units. I mean, I can understand the concept, but there's no meat on those bones here. As was mentioned before, relies on appropriate metrics of the minimum need for affordable housing units. These are things that the Secretary of OPM shall ensure in line 85. So effectively what we're doing is we're going to give a great deal of power to one person, effectively, to determine exactly what the parameters are for fair housing, affordable housing, and what fair share is, because they're going to be determining what fairly allocating means, what appropriate metrics means, what appropriate factors for fairly allocating means. These are not even remotely legitimate concepts. In line 131 and 132, 130, the Secretary, in consultation with the commissioners, and as may be determined by the Secretary, experts, advocates and organizations with expertise, I thought we just did experts in affordable housing, fair housing and planning and zoning, shall establish. What does that even mean? Not much. It doesn't mean much at all. It means that the Secretary is going to get people in a room that agree with them, and they're going to put forth what they think is the policy. And for people who are not familiar with government, the OPM Secretary is effectively a direct employee of the executive branch, the governor of the state, and therefore someone with a political agenda. Not necessarily someone that is desirous of putting together a thoughtful policy that is debated and approved by the legislature, because very little of what is in this bill we have any control of in this room, and we'll have very little control of when this bill hits the floor, because ultimately what is happening here is a major transfer in authority, not just from municipalities to the state government, but from the state government to the OPM Secretary specifically. And I believe it's dangerous. If you look at the sections that were referred to before as the actual parameters that we're going to operate on, starting line 141 through 161, I think, not less than 50% of the units are affordable to very low-income households, not less than 13% of units affordable to extremely low-income households, and so forth. These are arbitrary numbers. They're not based in anything. And we saw that very clearly in the public hearing when people who claim to have the data, we have the data to say how many affordable housing units need to be built in each town. And it was pointed out that in some places, they don't have the geography to even build those properties. As was mentioned before by my colleagues, very little is taken into consideration here. The environment, traffic concerns. Let's put up, so much more affordable housing in places that already have traffic jams. Does that make sense in the real world? I don't know. Schools, access to government aid. I think that's one of the reasons why so much affordable housing and low income housing is concentrated in the major cities right now, is because that's where the government provides certain aid. Um, I don't know that it makes sense. People are suggesting that people that live in Bridgeport would be better off if they instead lived in one of the fancier towns farther down the Gold Coast. Well, maybe, but they also might be farther away from things that they rely on, or farther from their job, or farther from other things. Maybe that's why they're not choosing to participate in those other communities. Anyway, Mr. Chairman, we could go through the bill. I think I said enough, and we've been here a very long time today. And I completely understand. One reason why I'm hesitant to even go through this bill in a fine tooth kind of way is because this is not the bill. I can be pretty confident in suggesting to everyone here that when this bill ultimately hits the House floor, it's not going to contain much of the same language that it does today. This is just a loosely written vehicle for how it will ultimately turn out. And that's an unfortunate reality. But I will predict here today that when the chairman gets up on the House floor to bring out this bill, his first words will be that there will be a strike all amendment. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I can't support something that flies in the face of a long-established system of right-sizing government, giving people I'll add one other thing to that, which is that each one of us up here on this dais, we represent our constituents back in our communities. So it's wrong for me to be telling the people back home that you and your opinions matter less than the OPM secretary's desire for the town of Wolcott, for example, on how much affordable housing should be built there. You should decide, and you should let the planning and zoning people in town decide. One thing that's very interesting about my experience in the state legislature is that almost every day there are issues that pop up between town government and state government. And I've done my best to stay out of the way of the town government's decision making. I wasn't elected to the town government. I don't want to make those decisions, and I don't want to step on the toes of the people that do. And the same goes for them. I don't want them telling me what to do either. And that's how our system works, and it works best that way. Those people that are local, close to the people that are most affected, should make the decisions, and we should stop trying to use a hammer. And this bill is more than a hammer. In fact, it is a brutal cudgel on town government's decision-making authority. It is bad policy, Mr. Chairman. I encourage everyone who has to vote on this to recognize what the people in their town would really want. Would they want the OPM secretary deciding what construction goes on in their district, or would they much rather decide for themselves through their own local planning and zoning where they have much more say? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.